Hey everyone, today we're going back into tens of thousands of years ago, when Europe was a very different place than it is today. Imagine endless cold steppes stretching out across the land, giant herds of reindeer and horses moving through the open plains. And here and there, small groups of humans living in shelters, making tools, creating ornaments, even playing music. These weren't Neanderthals anymore. These were people like us, Homo sapiens, the first modern humans to arrive in Europe. And the name archaeologists give to their culture is the Aurignacian. Now, the Aurignacian might sound like a mouthful, but it's one of the most important turning points in human history. It marks the very beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, which is basically the chapter of prehistory where humans really start to show the creativity, adaptability, and symbolic thinking that makes us who we are today. The Aurignacian lasted roughly from about 43,000 to 35,000 years ago, right in the middle of the last ice age. And what's interesting is that it stretched across such a huge area, from Spain and Britain in the west, all the way to Russia in the east. These people weren't just surviving, they were thriving, hunting mammoths and reindeer, building advanced tools, and leaving behind art that still amazes us today. Before this, earlier humans, like Neanderthals, were mostly making chunky stone flakes. Useful, yes, but limited. The Aurignacian people completely changed the game. They were experts in producing blades, long, thin pieces of stone that could be shaped into knives, scrapers, and points. They even made tiny versions called bladelets, which were less than a centimeter wide but incredibly useful for precision tasks, like making composite weapons. Imagine attaching a row of sharp little bladelets into a wooden shaft to create a deadly spear. Suddenly hunting became a whole lot more effective. But they didn't stop at stone. They began working with bone, antler, and ivory, shaping them into elegant spear points. Some were split at the base, some thick and massive, others more delicate, like double-beveled points. These weren't just tools, they were carefully crafted pieces of technology. Think about that for a second. Tens of thousands of years ago, people weren't just chipping rocks anymore. They were experimenting with different materials, refining designs, and creating objects that were practical, durable, and in some cases, even beautiful. And speaking of beauty, the Aurignacian gives us some of the first clear evidence of symbolic expression. They made beads from animal teeth, shells, bones, and stones, drilling holes in them so they could be strung together or worn. That might sound simple, but it represents something huge: identity. These ornaments weren't just decoration, they were a way of saying, "This is who I am," or "This is who I belong with." It's the beginnings of culture as we recognize it today, people using objects not just for survival, but for meaning. And then there's the art. This is the period when humans in Europe started carving figurines, painting on cave walls, and even making music. Yes, music. Archaeologists have found bone flutes from this time, some of the oldest instruments in the world. Just imagine a group of Aurignacian people sitting around a fire, under the stars, in a world still ruled by ice and mammoths, and someone starts playing a tune on a flute made of bone. That moment is over 35,000 years old, yet it feels so human, so relatable. Now, let's talk about where the Aurignacian gets its name. It all started in a small rock shelter in southern France called Aurignac, discovered back in 1852. At first, archaeologists divided the material into neat little phases: ancient, middle, and upper Aurignacian. But as excavations spread across Europe, things got messy. New sites didn't always fit into the categories. Some assemblages seemed to overlap, others didn't quite match. Over the decades, the classification of Aurignacian sites became a debate in itself, and to this day, archaeologists are still refining it. One of the key debates centers around the different variants of the Aurignacian. There's the Proto-Aurignacian, found mostly in southern Europe, which is thought to be the earliest form. Its bladelets are long and straight, carefully made from prismatic cores. Then you have the classic Aurignacian, which spread widely across Europe and used carinated scrapers to produce smaller, twisted bladelets. Some scholars say the classic Aurignacian eventually evolved into what's called the evolved Aurignacian, which had an even more diverse toolkit, including backed microblades. But others argue these weren't just stages of one culture, but different groups doing things their own way in different regions. It gets even more complicated when you look outside Europe. In Eastern Europe, there's something called the Aurignacian, which focused more on bone tools than stone. In the Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and surrounding areas, there's the so-called Levantine Aurignacian. But is it really connected to the European Aurignacian? The tools look similar in some ways, but the sites are younger and geographically separated by more than 1,000 kilometers. Some researchers think it's a cousin culture, others think it's something altogether different. The truth is, we don't fully know. And that brings us to one of the biggest questions of all. Who actually made the Aurignacian? The prevailing view is that it was modern humans, not Neanderthals. After all, we do have some human fossils from Aurignacian contexts in places like France, Italy, Bulgaria, and Russia. But the evidence isn't always straightforward. Sometimes the bones and tools aren't found together, or the dating is uncertain. Still, the overall picture suggests that the Aurignacian represents the spread of Homo sapiens into Europe, the first great wave of our species on that continent. And when did it begin, and how did it spread? Well, many scholars place the start of the Proto-Aurignacian around 43,000 years ago. By 38,000 years ago, the classic Aurignacian was firmly established across much of Europe. But the exact origins are hotly debated. Some argue it came from the early Aurignacian culture in the Levant, which produced similar fine blades and bladelets. Others think it arose independently in Central or Western Europe, perhaps developing out of earlier transitional industries that bridged the gap between Neanderthals and modern humans. There's even evidence from Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan of assemblages that look Aurignacian-like, suggesting a possible Eastern origin. And in Siberia's Altai Mountains, archaeologists have found Aurignacian-like tools that could indicate parallel development. The spread itself is another mystery. Did groups move gradually along the Danube River, using it as a natural corridor? Did others follow the Mediterranean coast? Was it a single wave or multiple routes taken by different communities? Each new discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, but the full picture is still elusive. So, why did the Aurignacian emerge at all? Some say it was simply the result of modern humans replacing Neanderthals. Others argue there was interaction between the two, with ideas and techniques passing back and forth. It's even been suggested that Neanderthals influenced the Aurignacians in some ways and vice versa. What's clear is that this was a period of huge cultural change. People were experimenting more with new tool types, diversifying their diets, and creating new forms of symbolic behavior. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Remember, Neanderthals were still around in some areas when the Aurignacian began. There were contact zones, regions where the two groups may have encountered each other. Did they compete? Did they trade? Did they intermarry? We know from genetics that modern humans and Neanderthals did mix, so it's entirely possible that cultural exchanges happened too. Looking at the Aurignacian across Europe, we see not just survival, but community, creativity, and resilience. Their ornaments suggest personal identity, and maybe even group affiliation. Their art raises questions about ritual, spirituality, and how they saw the world around them. Their settlements show us how they organized space, sometimes even building structures to shelter against the Ice Age cold. And their tools reflect a society constantly adapting, innovating, and pushing boundaries. Even though we've studied the Aurignacian for over a century and a half, so much remains unknown. Many sites were excavated long ago, before modern methods, so we don't always have the details we'd like. New techniques, like radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, and microwear studies are helping, but there's still a long way to go. What we do know is that the Aurignacian represents one of the most critical leaps in human history, a time when modern humans truly began to act, think, and express themselves in ways that we can still recognize today.